swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. That was a Negro spiritual or plantation song written by then slave Wallace Willis. I too am a descendant from a slave. My great grandfather was Josiah Henson. If you're familiar with history, then you know that Josiah Henson was the inspiration for Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. He was former slave turned author, minister, abolitionist. I turn to the side, I look a little bit like him without the beard. My great grandfather escaped to Canada, but returned to the United States to push 200 more slaves through the womb of the Underground Railroad. In Canada, he established a laborer's school in an area called Dawn Township. It became one of the final stops in the Underground Railroad. My great grandfather was the first Black man to appear on a Canadian stamp and the first ex-slave to gain audience with Queen Victoria. I'm so proud of him, I can burst. When anyone asks me of my ancestry, I stick out my chest a little bit further than my belly and tell them all about my family history. Josiah Henson risked his life, indeed his very breath, for the freedom of the next generation. I am that generation. For centuries, Blacks and whites have been working together for a common goal. It was an unnamed white minister who encouraged Granddaddy to pursue his freedom. Unfortunately, he was swindled out of his money by his master. That was the impetus that pushed him to escape to Canada with wife and children. The Underground Railroad wasn't solely the brainchild of Negro slaves. There were many midwives along the way. Blacks and whites working together under the sole conviction that all people should be free. One such example was Quaker Isaac Hopper. Isaac Hopper hid slaves in his home. His pale hand shoved many a sweaty slave into storage boxes, crawl spaces, and under creaking floorboards. He also established a network of safe houses and placed informants among the slave hunters so that he can learn of their plans. Isaac Hopper was the 19th century Bond, James Bond. White abolitionist John Brown despised slavery. He also hid slaves in his home and his warehouse. After the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, John Brown gathered many fearless men and created an anti-slave militia. Attempting to incite a slave rebellion, John Brown was caught and hung. He gave his final suffocating breath fighting for the freedom of slaves. After his death, a song was penned in his honor. One line from the song goes, "John Brown died that slaves may be free, but his soul keeps marching on." You may be familiar with Thomas Garrett. He was friend of Harriet Tubman and would provide her with food and clothing on her escape missions. Thomas Garrett was dragged into court for his anti-slave activities. Unafraid, he proclaimed before the entire courtroom that he will continue to fight for the freedom of slaves. He risked his life and his fortune to get slaves above the Mason-Dixon line. In his will, he asked that his pallbearers be African Americans. I cannot neglect to mention humanitarian Levi Coffin. He was known as the president of the Underground Railroad. The Levi Coffin House is a historic landmark in the state of Indiana. It's open Tuesday to Saturday, 10 to 5, and children under 6 are free. Although it was illegal to help runaway slaves, Levi Coffin assisted over 3,000 slaves to freedom. He wrote, "The dictates of humanity came in opposition to the law of the land, and we ignored the law." Forrest Gump may argue that life is like a box of chocolates. My contention is, life is like a playground merry-go-round. You hop on in the center, grab one of the bars, and hang on for dear life. If you're anything like me when I was a little girl, you may have regurgitated on yourself or others, or you may have flown headlong into the dirt. Like a child, you stand up, dust yourself off, and run giggling back to the merry-go-round. Now, you can play on the merry-go-round all by yourself. One lonely foot hangs off and presses into the ground to generate spinning. Riding the merry-go-round is so much more fun when we ride together. When each person takes their turn, we ride longer and go faster. That's why we don't say "I," but we say "we" when we're really having a good time. The Civil Rights Movement was also a team effort. People of all races marching together under the sole conviction that all people should be treated equally. Justice Earl Warren became famous, arguing against segregation in the Brown versus the Board of Education case. Desegregation came at a bloody price. Today, Tyrone and Timmy can sit in the same classroom and receive the same education. Remember the beating of freedom rider James Swert? He's still alive and living in Wisconsin. He left his white suburban home with the recently deceased Congressman John Lewis and other Black and white students for a ride through the segregated South. Think about it. It was less than 60 years ago when Blacks and whites were forbidden to ride together on public transportation. Swerd volunteered to be the first off the bus and was snatched away by an angry mob. He was beaten, black-eyed, busted teeth, broken vertebrae. He spent 2 of his 5 days in the hospital unconscious. There is a line from the ancient book that says, "No greater love has no man than this, that he laid down his life for his friends." Swerd was quoted as saying that he never felt so alive as he did than when he was a freedom rider. Today, we are seeing more and more images that threaten to completely tear apart the fabric of society. That is not to say that there weren't pre-existing rips and tears. I love to run, but I haven't run in my neighborhood since May 25th, 2020. The racial tension in America is extremely high. The aftermath of these events has left me out of breath and birthed this poem called Asthma. When I was a child, I had asthma. Playing too much, running too far, my lungs would tighten. I could not breathe. Wheezing and clutching and stretching my hands toward the air, shoving it into my mouth, I learned quickly that no one was going to breathe for me. Sometimes I'd fall down. I suppose they couldn't hear me gasping for air when they asked me if my skin was brown because I ate all the chocolate, or if I shaved my armpits and ate chicken and watermelon. I hate watermelon because the black seeds are spit out, discarded. I suppose they couldn't hear me panting for air when they egged and dented my car on the first night in the neighborhood. I didn't know. I wasn't invited to learn the proper words in the dictionary, but I know the B words and the N words and all the words that keep me from breathing. Lately, I'm having a hard time trying to catch my breath, afraid to run, afraid of having an asthma attack, and no one will hear me when I stop breathing. There is hope. As long as we have breath, there is hope. History has proven that in small ways and big ways, we can come together as humans. We can take the hand of someone of another culture, look them in the eye and ask, how can I help? Or help me understand. My grandfather risked his life, indeed his very breath, for the freedom of future generations. I am that generation. You are that generation. Let's build a modern day underground railroad. Like freedom riders, let's ride through the broken places of society and bring justice through peace and healing through love. Together, we can do it. One step at a time, one voice at a time, one breath at a time. Madam Toastmaster.